You've been performing for so long, you forgot who you were before the applause. You don't need a new identity. You need to come home to the one you abandoned. It's time to change the narrative. It's time to recognize who you are. You are not an imposter. You are not a mistake. You are not a placeholder in your own life. You weren't the imposter. You were the target. And that truth is uncomfortable because it forces you to confront the environments, relationships, and systems that benefited from your self-doubt. The imposter phenomenon didn't emerge from your lack of ability. It emerged from the way you were made to question your reality. You didn't wake up one day and decide you weren't enough. Someone somewhere taught you to believe that. And once that seed was planted, it became easy for others to manipulate the doubt they helped create. The lie was never yours. It was handed to you, repeated to you, reinforced around you, and weaponized against you. People who felt threatened by your competence needed a narrative that made you shrink. People who relied on your silence needed a story that made you second guess your voice. People who feared your growth needed a label that made you feel unworthy of rising. You weren't the imposter. You were the one they needed to keep small so they could feel big. When you look back, you can trace the moments where the targeting began, the subtle comments, the dismissive reactions, the strategic withholding of praise, the way your accomplishments were minimized or reframed as luck, the way your questions were treated as incompetence instead of curiosity. These weren't random interactions. They were conditioning. They were shaping your identity in real time, teaching you to distrust your own brilliance. And that's why words matter. The term imposter syndrome was never accurate. It implied a personal flaw, a psychological deficiency, a self-generated insecurity, but the research has always been clear. It was imposter phenomenon, a response to external forces, not an internal failure. You weren't broken. You were responding to environments that made you doubt what was already true about you. The lie was in the language, and the language protected the systems that benefited from your doubt. Once you understand that you were targeted, the entire narrative shifts. You stop asking, "What's wrong with me?" and start asking, "Who taught me to question myself?" You stop wondering why you never felt confident and start recognizing who profited from your insecurity. You stop blaming yourself for the doubt and start seeing the architecture of the environments that built it. You weren't the imposter. You were the one being shaped by people who needed you uncertain. The targeting wasn't always loud. Sometimes it was quiet, subtle, almost invisible. It looked like being passed over for opportunities you were qualified for. It looked like being praised privately but ignored publicly. It looked like being told you were not ready when you were already outperforming the people making the decisions. It looked like being asked to do the work but not given the title. These weren't coincidences. They were strategies. And when you internalize those strategies long enough, the imposter phenomenon begins to feel like your own voice. You start repeating the lies they planted. You start doubting the abilities you've already proven. You start shrinking in spaces you were meant to expand in. You start believing you need permission to be who you already are. That's the power of being targeted. The lie becomes so familiar that it feels like truth. But here's the turning point. Once you name the targeting, you reclaim the narrative. You begin to see your competence clearly. You begin to recognize your patterns of excellence. You begin to trust your instincts again. You begin to understand that your doubt was never a reflection of your ability. It was a reflection of your environment. And when the environment changes, the doubt loses its power. You weren't the imposter. You were the one who kept showing up despite the targeting. You were the one who kept learning, growing, contributing, and excelling even while carrying the weight of someone else's insecurity. You were the one who kept rising even when the narrative tried to pull you down. That's not imposter behavior. That's resilience. That's brilliance. That's truth. And now you get to decide what happens next. You get to decide whether you continue living inside a lie that was never yours. You get to decide whether you keep shrinking to make others comfortable. You get to decide whether you keep performing for people who never intended to see you. You get to decide whether you keep carrying doubt that was planted in you for someone else's benefit. You get to decide whether the targeting ends with you. The moment you release the lie, you reclaim your identity. You reclaim your voice. You reclaim your confidence. You reclaim your belonging. You reclaim your truth. And in that reclamation, the imposter phenomenon dissolves because it cannot survive in environments where you are seen, valued, and affirmed. It cannot survive in spaces where your brilliance is recognized instead of feared. It cannot survive in narratives you no longer agree to carry. You weren't the imposter, you were the target. But now you are the truth teller. You are the one naming what happened. You are the one rewriting the narrative. You are the one stepping into clarity. And once you see the lie for what it was, you never go back to believing it again. And once you understand that you were the target, you begin to see how much of your life was shaped by narratives that were never rooted in truth. You start recognizing how many decisions you made from a place of doubt instead of confidence. You start noticing how often you held back your ideas, your brilliance, your leadership because you were afraid of being seen as too much. But that fear wasn't yours. It was planted in you by people who were terrified of what your full power would reveal about their own limitations. You also begin to see how the targeting influenced your relationships, how you gravitated toward people who mirrored the environments that made you question yourself, how you tolerated behaviors that chipped away at your confidence because they felt familiar, how you accepted roles that required you to shrink because shrinking had become a survival strategy. When you realized you were the target, you stopped blaming yourself for the patterns you developed to survive the lie. And then comes the anger, not destructive anger, but clarifying anger, the kind that wakes you up, the kind that makes you say, I deserve better than that, the kind that makes you reclaim your boundaries with precision, the kind that makes you stop negotiating with narratives that were never built for your liberation. Anger becomes a compass, pointing you back to yourself. And once you reclaim that truth, you start to see the patterns you missed before. You notice how often your competence was reframed as coincidence. You notice how your clarity was treated as arrogance. You notice how your questions were labeled as doubt instead of discernment. You notice how your excellence made people uncomfortable long before you ever questioned your worth. These realizations aren't meant to create bitterness. They're meant to create awareness. Awareness is what frees you from repeating the same cycles with new people in new environments. You also begin to understand that being targeted wasn't a reflection of your weakness. It was a reflection of your strength. People don't target what they don't perceive as powerful. They don't undermine what they don't see as capable. They don't gaslight what they don't fear. The very fact that you were made to doubt yourself is evidence that someone recognized your brilliance before you did. They saw your potential clearly, and instead of supporting it, they tried to contain it. And when you finally see that, something inside you shifts. You stop apologizing for your gifts. You stop shrinking your voice. You stop dimming your light. You stop making yourself small to protect people who were never protecting you. You stop carrying the emotional weight of other people's insecurity. You stop believing that confidence is dangerous. You stop believing that excellence needs permission. You stop believing that belonging requires silence. This is the moment where your identity begins to rebuild itself, not from the fragments of doubt, but from the foundation of truth. You start remembering who you were before the targeting. You start reconnecting with the parts of yourself that were buried under years of manipulation. You start reclaiming the strengths you were taught to minimize. You start honoring the intuition you were told to ignore. You start seeing yourself without the distortion. And as your identity rebuilds, your boundaries rebuild with it. You become less tolerant of environments that thrive on confusion. You become less available to people who need you uncertain. You become less accessible to narratives that require your silence. You become less willing to participate in dynamics that depend on your shrinking. You become less interested in relationships that cannot hold your truth. Boundaries aren't punishment, they're protection. You also begin to realize that healing from imposter phenomenon isn't about becoming someone new. It's about returning to who you were before the lie. It's about remembering your competence. It's about reclaiming your belonging. It's about restoring your confidence. It's about reconnecting with your intuition. It's about honoring your brilliance. Healing isn't becoming, healing is returning. And in that return, you start to see your story differently. You recognize the moments where you rose even when you doubted yourself. You recognize the achievements you earned even while carrying the weight of someone else's insecurity. You recognize the resilience you demonstrated even when the narrative tried to break you. You recognize the strength you embodied even when you didn't feel strong. You recognize the truth that was always present, even when the lie was loud. This is where empowerment begins, not in pretending the targeting didn't happen, but in naming it so it loses its power, not in denying the doubt, but in understanding where it came from, not in blaming yourself, but in reclaiming yourself. Empowerment is the moment you stop internalizing what was never yours and start living in what has always been true. And once you reach that point, the world looks different. Opportunities feel different. Relationships feel different. Your voice feels different. Your presence feels different. You walk differently. You choose differently. You speak differently. You show up differently because you're no longer navigating life through the lens of a lie. You're navigating it through the clarity of truth. You weren't the imposter. You were the target. But now you are the one who sees clearly. You are the one who names the lie. You are the one who reclaims your identity. You are the one who rises without apology. And once you rise in truth, you never return to the environments that required your doubt. Before you go, the Impostor Phenomenon Guide is a free digital workbook designed to help you recognize self-doubt, reclaim your confidence, and own every accomplishment you've earned. No fluff, no toxic positivity, just real tools that work. If you're listening on a podcast platform, the link is in the description. If you're on YouTube, it's pinned in the channel links as well. Go grab it, friend. It's waiting for you. So take a breath, settle in, and let's begin the work of separating who you are from who you've been performing to be, because it's time to stop performing and start belonging. Welcome to the work. Welcome to the becoming. Welcome to unmasking the imposter. Thank you for listening to the Impostor Phenomenon podcast. If today's episode opened something in you, share it with someone who needs this conversation too. Make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an episode. And if you're ready to go deeper, get ready to join our community where we're doing the real work of reclaiming identity, rewriting narratives, and rebuilding belonging from the inside out. Remember, You are not an imposter. You are not a mistake. You are the author